Good morning. We have the opportunity today to listen to two of our accomplished members who are both on the board. And Richard Johnson has been a big fan of research and done a lot of, had his own business. He has a PhD and a Bachelor of Administration in chemistry, and he's been very active in working with publications. He's the journal of the, I think the Journal of the Organic Chemistry. He's published 3 publications, and he's printed 2 books, which he has for sale in the back. He's been raised a Presbyterian, I believe, or at least a Protestant, turned Catholic to get married, and with that kind of a background in science, he feels he's in a good position to evaluate the world in the sense of how people relate to those two. So I think that's basically the gist of what you're going to be talking about today, Richard. And I think he's been working on this in his own head. This last book, I think, has been something that's been gnawing away at him for a long time to come up with this idea. And I think he's presented the book in a way in which he'd like to describe to you. And if you're interested, he certainly has them for sale back there at $10 a piece, or for both of his books for $18. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Richard, right? Right. Okay, Johnson.
Good morning. Everybody said this morning, Richard, is that you? Because I've had a cold for the past week and I sound like 1 octave lower than I usually do. But the important thing is that you hear me today. I think this is working okay. Thank you all for coming. And I want to thank especially Jerry and the board for inviting me to talk to you this morning about 2 books I've published. They're highlighted on the screen. On the left, Religion, the Failed Narrative was published in 2011. And The Human Identity Problem was just released this past November. The title of my talk this morning is A Mechanism for God Creation. My contention is that consciousness, human consciousness, is the site of all God concepts throughout history, in all of their forms. God, then, is a human artifact, a fiction. I need to talk to you a bit this morning about human consciousness. We're all conscious. It's really the definition of being human. But we all take it for granted and don't think too much about it. Although, for most of us, thinking is what consciousness is all about. It is essentially a human trait. But there's this huge confusion. Religion proclaims that consciousness is the soul, and the soul is a gift from God. When God gave us all a soul, He raised us to the pinnacle of His creation. My, what a boost in ego. I mean, this really, if you have trouble feeling that you have a special place in the world, this could certainly send you over the top. And I think that's what sends religion over the top in most cases. This notion, of course, is exceedingly plausible. It's not hard at all to believe this, and it generates most of theology. But then evolutionary biologists come along and spoil everything by explaining what consciousness really is. It's an evolutionary trait. Archaeologists, through dating, pinpoint to some level of error the arrival of consciousness in the human species sometime around 40,000 years ago. And there's no mention of God. Evolutionary biologists talk about benefits to the organism. In biology, all organisms are changing all the time. Any kind of small incremental change is kept in the world by its benefit or non-benefit to that species in its abilities to survive. Well, what is the evolutionary benefit of consciousness? Well, it's self-awareness. That's what consciousness is. But self-awareness means that we recognize ourselves as separate from everything else in the material world. Moreover, we recognize other conscious human beings as like us. This allows for the really big benefit, the development of language, and then writing. Now, humans could develop strategies for survival. This is a huge boost. And you can see how successful it's been. There's 7 billion people on the planet. Now, most scientific discoveries are accepted by the population. When we explain gravity, nobody complains. Oh, that's not true. Electromagnetism, hey, sounds all right to me. But if you say that humans have evolved from some line of ancestors that go all the way back to zero, that's offensive. So most people over the world still say that consciousness is the soul created by God. Humans are too special, people say. Well, with that buildup of being the pinnacle of creation, do you need anything more to feel good? And the concept of soul goes back thousands of years. We all revere tradition. The older it is, it seems like the more true it is. People say, how could such tradition be wrong? And of course, once again, the soul concept is enormously powerful and persuasive. But there's a downside of consciousness. I've talked about the survival benefits, but consciousness has a sort of amnesia-like quality to it. And you all know what amnesia is. It's a temporary loss of memory. People forget their name, maybe forget where they live. Well, consciousness makes us ask these questions of ourselves variously throughout our lives. How did I begin? How did I get here? And maybe why was I born in this particular place? But here's the ringer. Do I really die like other people? Did those other people really die? These are powerful, clawing questions, but most of us encounter these questions variously throughout our lives. these downside issues set our consciousness up for rescue by creating God. And this has given religion its opening. Belief, as well as non-belief, is a continuum. There are a lot of believers out there who are doubters. And there are a lot of non-believers who aren't quite sure they are committed to that belief, and they may change back and forth in this regard for themselves. But I think most of us here today would disagree with the notion that God implants a soul in us at birth or conception, as the religious rite would have it. And most of you would say, you're crazy to the notion that something called the soul, our consciousness, floats off to heaven when we die. But for all of us, these questions are intensely personal. It depends on what exactly is going on in our lives. Our consciousness and our humanity often distort our thinking, even for atheists. So non-believers can have moments when they will say, well, I really have trouble with deciding how I got here and who I am, so maybe there really is a mysterious explanation for it after all. And self-awareness, wow, it's like, I can't get over thinking. It's like, how did this happen? It's a pretty big deal. Maybe some of those enlightened preachers could tell me why this happened. And we all have that moment sometimes. Am I feeling a little spiritual today? It sounds like a weak spot when you're just about ready to shove over into the belief camp again. A French proverb says, "A fish cannot see the water it swims in." Think about it. If I rephrase that from a point of view of consciousness, a conscious person cannot know what consciousness means to them. It sort of means that we're constantly befuddled by the fact that we are thinking and don't know how we came to think. We get tired of these endlessly unanswerable questions, and sometimes we just give it up. But theologians of all stripes step in because they've got answers. I want to talk just a bit about the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks were really one of the more successful, outstanding societies of ancient times. They did a lot of thinking. They were great champs of intuitive thought. Intuitive thought is just everyday thinking, but Greeks really played intuitive thought around the track many, many times. Intuitive thought is simply how things seem. But concepts such as the soul were common in the ancient Greek record, which started sometime before 600 BCE. Thales, a philosopher of the period, is noted to have said that things were full of gods. This was apparently Thales' way of explaining the questions he had about why things happen the way they do. And Aristotle, some 200 years later, offered that a magnet has a soul in it because it moves iron. Well, that was Aristotle's early version of electromagnetism. He didn't know, but he thought that a soul was responsible. The soul and God were common concepts in ancient Greece. But let's be clear about intuition. It simply means that reasoning plays no part. We don't really think about whether an intuitive thought is right or wrong, incorrect or correct. And the phrase critical intuition is obviously an oxymoron. Intuition is usually regarded as the successful moment when something is discovered just by pure thought, such as Archimedes when he discovered that things float in the bathtub. That was his eureka moment. But like gambling losses, intuition is usually not associated with bad guesses. We always remember the good ones. He did it by pure intuition. This graphic shows how intuition seems to play out. The red indicates uncertainty and conflict. On the left, you have concepts about knowledge, God, soul, ideas, in a frame of uncertainty that is sort of nascent. It's just beginning. The more these concepts are mulled about and developed, they come into conflict with one another because their correctness is never sorted out. So as time goes on, conflict builds in intuitive thought. Contrary to contemporary opinion, the ancient Greeks were not scientists. Oh, there were some scientist types in Greek society. Democritus was one. He was a contemporary of Plato, and he was in a small school known as atomist. He believed that material objects to be made out of small units that he called atoms. Sound familiar? That was intuition, and it turns out to be sort of correct. But here's the thing. Plato absolutely distrusted the senses to deliver pathways to knowledge. He considered such information illusory. Well, Plato was the person that had the sway in Greek history. His thoughts were the ones that got passed down through history. The sum total is that the beginnings of science, which have to do with observing nature and making explanations about them, were suppressed. Science begins with intuition when it begins. Hypotheses or explanations of things that happen in nature are all intuitive. But the difference is, in science, a testing program is devised. Concepts such as God and soul were considered knowledge by the ancient Greeks. These concepts were gained through intuition, but they were never questioned. And as I have mentioned, observations of natural phenomena, the beginnings of science, were distrusted. So intuitive knowledge, which is itself somewhat of an oxymoron, became king. All throughout history, which has been enormously polytheistic until the more current times, and still there's lots of polytheism in the world. But in ancient times, amongst all the polytheism was a general notion about a master-type God, who we may denote it with a capital G. Pythagoras mentioned this kind of God, and Heraclitus, a contemporary of Pythagoras, made distinctions between God, the big guy, and mere gods. Mathematics was developed by the Greeks. They developed geometry. Now, they were ahead of the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians in that those societies did not develop geometry. But mathematics is intuitive, but it has a way of presenting magic that convinces you that this intuitive thought is golden. Mathematics is axiomatic or intuitive, but because of the successes, and I can mention the Pythagorean theorem, which shows the special relationship between the sides of a right triangle, these kinds of deductions were not really possible by just looking at the triangle, but through mathematics, one could discover these secrets. The success of intuitive thought through mathematics bolstered the confidence in intuitive thought in general. Here's an example of how things were proved in ancient Greece. Socrates was absolutely convinced that his soul was immortal. Now, Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenian authorities, apparently for his outspokenness and obstreperousness. Socrates said, fine. He accepted the execution, but he wanted it on his own terms. He would self-administer his own execution by drinking hemlock. Before the execution, he invited all of his friends over, and they had a party. You would never guess that this was any kind of a death sentence. And at an appointed moment, he drinks the hemlock and dies. This blew Plato away. He writes all this, records it carefully, and it becomes a proof of immortality, which still, 2,500 years later, stands solid. Plato was a prolific writer, and he was writing mostly about his intuitive successes, or the intuitive successes of the day. The archive of Plato's work became a source of a considerable portion of Christian doctrine centuries later. You know, science could have taken care of this whole thing way back then. But religion became stronger and stronger. Finally, it became a political force. Christianity became a political force in the 4th century of the Common Era. Constantine declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Subsequently, canonization of intuitive thought led to concepts like God's will is the highest authority. Who proved that? Who even said that was possible? Islam became a political force in the Arabian Peninsula around the 7th century of the Common Era. Once these political forces took hold, it became very hard to do a lot of things. It became very hard to do science. You'll note that there's a lot of circularity in the thinking. God proves God. No one questioned these things. Against this backdrop, consciousness is eternally confounding. It's like arriving in the middle of a movie. We've all done that, and we try to think, well, what was the beginning like? None of us remember our birth Oh, I know there's been claims, but no one remembers their birth. This is a terrible disadvantage when it comes to trying to figure out how you got someplace. If you didn't know how you actually got someplace, you can't remember that. But that's the way biology works. That's how consciousness works. Most people don't have any memories at all until they're a couple, 3 years old. And consciousness seems ongoing or eternal. These qualities give consciousness a mystical or irrational aspect. Humanity's rhetorical questions. We all have these intrusions into our lives as we get older. Chronic questions that will stop us sometimes and say, well, who am I? Why am I here? And what happens to me when my body physically dies? These kinds of confounding questions set us up for irrational incursions. Now we're ready to believe anything. And religion steps up to the plate and proudly answers all those questions. I or we are created by God. I or we are here to do God's work. I or we will live on in eternity with God. We get the chance to meet him now if we faithfully carry out his will. Intuition carried without any kind of confirmation is dangerous. And this kind of overstepping sets religion up for foreclosure. Bankruptcy. Notice that morality is set up in this now. Morality is all about obeying God, and that's still true. But when this happens, a lot of humanity's free spirit is locked in, and there's an ultimate setup for total control by outside agents. Time for a progress report. My contention is that God is an artifact of consciousness. The narrative so far shows how intuitive, that's unsubstantiated thought, leads naturally to concepts of God and soul. But the God in this context is out there somewhere. Not here, out there somewhere. And canonization of religious doctrine ultimately places humanity in a headlock. Science finally makes a debut. I talked about Democritus, but he was just like a match in the wind back in ancient Greece. There was a brief appearance of rational thought in the Muslim world around the 10th century. Avicenna was a scholar of the period who wrote texts advancing chemistry, medicine, and astronomy. But on his death, he and his school were banished and declared heretics by Islamic theologians. And 1,000 years later, this policy still is in effect: no science. In the West, science was a little luckier. Around 1600, science starts to appear. But these initial efforts were carefully watched by the church. Science has a history of being like a teenager struggling for independence. Education, even today, is closely tied to religion. That's where all the money is. Science remains, even now, tethered to church rules. There has to be an effort to retain focus on God. And if an investigation, and evolution is one of those, shows up contradictory evidence, hey, we don't offend God here. Science has the history, then, of always rocking the boat. Galileo was one of the first scientific heretics. He agreed with Copernicus that the sun was the center of the solar system, not the earth. He was tried by the Roman Inquisition and sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. Darwin, when he published Origin of the Species in 1859, he wasn't taken seriously at first. But then comes the relentless proving of evolution, how true it is, how every aspect seems to fall in place. And this becomes finally abhorrent. Finally, large swaths of the public reject and vehemently oppose evolution. Then we have the curious case of Professor Stephen Jay Gould, a respected Harvard paleontologist, who proposed in the 1990s that religion and science are separate realms. Scientists can't probe religion. And as if religion would want to probe science, it was really to guard whatever Gould's reasons. He had a name for this. He called these realms non-overlapping magisteria, noma. These things set us back, keep the church in power. Science is conflict resolution. When a natural phenomenon, whatever it is, wind, rain, is observed, and you want to explain something like that, you use your intuition to do this. And what happens is you may have several candidate explanations. These are called hypotheses. Before any action is taken, these candidate explanations are in play. They're in competition with one another. They're in conflict. Testing resolves or narrows the conflict. So the process of science is conflict resolution. Finally, we achieve the level of a theory. Now, notice that religion generates conflict. Religion is intuitive thought that never enters the test phase. Indeed, testing is considered unnecessary because the thought is correct after all. At best, religious doctrine is unresolved candidate hypotheses that remain in conflict. This graphic summarizes these ideas. On the left, you'll see, once again, intuitive ideas in a state of conflict. If we're looking at natural phenomena, we advance explanations, which are candidate explanations. These are hypotheses. Now the conflict begins to be resolved, which is indicated by the blue. Finally, after testing and conflict resolution, we get to theories like gravity, evolution, electromagnetism. You know, this process never ends. If there was some new information that would challenge the way gravity is understood, science would consider it. It becomes bluer and bluer as the axis goes out. Each religious doctrine states its answers to humanity's rhetorical questions: who am I, etc. Before the test phase, each hypothesis is either correct or incorrect. Is any of religious doctrine correct? Religious doctrine, by definition, forbids any discussion which challenges the premise, this doctrine is true. And this is summarized by this graphic. Intuition and religion. Do you see any blue here? No, it gets black. What happens is the more that you insist that intuitive ideas are correct, by even taking steps of like codification, writing down scripture, and canonizing this into doctrine, the more in the hole you get, the more uncertain it gets, the more conflict there is. The black indicates catastrophic conflict. Look at what's going on in Syria. You know, they say there's going to be a civil war there at some point. The civil war seems to be about which version of God is correct. It just seems to be that kind of thing. And over throughout history, that kind of question has led to war. Anthropomorphism is simply the concept of recognizing the human form. Now, this gets muddled in Scripture. In Genesis, the famous verse goes, God created man in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Well, this is a case of false intuition. This is one of those bad guesses. Here's the way it really goes. Evolutionary biology says that self-awareness is successful because we recognize the human form. We're able to talk with other human forms. If we have problems answering questions, the most likely answer is some human form who has the answer. So instead of God creating us, we create the image of God who creates us. I want to talk about holograms. You all know what holograms are. You know, they're in science fiction movies. When somebody's teleported, you know, he slowly disappears, and he appears someplace else. Well, that process graphically is done with holograms. Finally, you see, just before the person disappears, a sort of an eerie, form where the person is almost there, and then he disappears. Here's an example of a hologram. You'll see the person on the right obviously looks a little strange. Well, he's not there. This is a holographic projection. He's actually more solid than most holographic projections. Usually it's more ghost-like, where you can sort of see right through them. Well, that's the concept I want to retain here. What did I do? I pressed some key in the dark here, and now I can't get out of this.
Click outside of the box. Click outside. Click as
here?
Press it. That take care of it?
Okay, great. Thank you. This light here is really.
That's needed for the video.
Oh, okay, okay. Trying to understand how we see ourselves as conscious human beings. I think a holographic image is sort of useful because this kind of ghost-like image is useful, I think, in explaining how consciousness seems to us. And I think ultimately it's useful for explaining how we create God. When you've looked in the bathroom mirror, most of the time you're brushing your teeth or shaving, but sometime in your life you've taken that long look in the mirror and say, well, that's me. Or, is that me? Well, we finally get into this little argument, who me is. When I look at my hand, I say, my hand, as if there's some agency that's looking at my hand. Well, it's my consciousness that's looking at the hand. Well, is my consciousness my body? No, it's in my body somewhere. So when you're looking in the mirror, what we call me is created by a constellation of neurons firing in the brain. So I am inside the body whose image I see in the mirror. You could ask the question, well, what do I look like? It's another rhetorical question. When we deal with difficult concepts like consciousness that are a total mystery, I think a holographic image, which sort of is like this. You look in the mirror and you say, well, that is me, that's my body, but I'm inside there somewhere. And when you tend to peer in that way, you almost see, you can't really see a person anymore. And that's what I contend is a holographic image. Here is the cover of Religion, the Failed Narrative. And you'll notice the human form peering out from the background. Well, that's my best rendition of how we think God looks like. This is sort of an artist representation. But notice that the barest essentials are there. There's the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. Evolution teaches us, if we can use that word, to recognize the human form. So that's my idea of how God looks like. Now, we can't see. I want to know actually how Michelangelo did his Sistine Chapel thing. Obviously, God didn't pose for him, but what kind of likeness was he thinking about when he drew that famous picture of God passing on life to humanity? Obviously, we will employ the help of other human forms to help us. Well, God, in all of his forms, is some kind of intelligent human form. It's just that we create them in our heads. It's not any place outside. So if you really want to know what God looks like, I would recommend just thinking of him in this sort of holographic way. Why are these questions so difficult, and why do I say they're rhetorical? Well, we need to talk a little bit about Kurt Gödel. Kurt Gödel was an Austrian logician who proposed his incompleteness theorem in 1931. Here's what was happening to mathematics about this time. Mathematics, once again, is intuitive, but mathematicians such as Bertrand Russell and David Hilbert were thinking that we know just about all there is about mathematics by this time, and we should be able to write the whole thing down in a little set of rules. And when they set out to do that, they couldn't stop writing. The rules went on and on and on. They finally stopped their effort. Well, Gödel explained this. He says that attempting to summarize any axiomatic system or intuitive system in a self-consistent set of rules is impossible. This was a logical proof, but other people have explained it over time. It's been 100 years almost since Gödel proposed his incompleteness theorem. The problem seems to be in human language itself. Think about it. When we write down the alphabet or numerals, we invented those. The numeral 1 does not exist in nature. We had to think about how to describe this idea, and this was our best effort. Well, it's imperfect. Everything we do is imperfect. It's impossible for us to be totally apart from the thing that we study. We're always involved in it in some regard. So there's a subjectivity about our investigations that we don't want, but nevertheless have to put up with. This leads to paradoxes. Where it's true, coming and going. Jacob Bernowski, you may remember, was the producer of the popular series Ascent of Man, sometime in the 70s maybe. Bernowski loved to explain science and mathematics to the public, and he took on explaining Gödel. This is from what Bronowski said about Gödel. He said that any language we devise ultimately employs self-reference. Sure, we're going to talk about ourselves, but self-reference intrinsically leads to paradoxical statements. Case in point, the liar's paradox. I'm sure you've all played with this one at times in your life. Consider the sentence, "This very sentence is false." What gives here? It's both true and false. Rebecca Goldstein, who did a lot of explaining of Gödel, she calls this kind of situation a case where the mind crashes. And Bronowski says that a paradox is the logical consequence of self-reference in human language. Well, surprise, surprise, we come full circle. Humanity's rhetorical questions are all self-referential. Insidiously, this places any kind of self-investigation, who am I, in foreclosure. Religion's answers, so-called answers, are premature. All intuitive statements require confirmation in order to be taken seriously. Well, the ball is back in religion's court, but hasn't it been back in religion's court for about two millennia? Poor God. Here we describe him this way and that way. But, the Greeks didn't know any better, and I'm not saying they're stupid. It's just that they really hadn't developed their thought processes to the extent that we have today. And Plato could have been less in his head. He could have encouraged Democritus in his emerging science. And shame on those Islamic theologians who declared Avicenna a heretic. Boy, they sure spoiled things. For 1,000, even till the day, it's still spoiled. Try to do any science in that area of the world. And then there is William of Ockham, of Occam's razor fame. In 1310 or thereabout, he famously said, God should be accepted on faith alone. Wow. Well, that's still the leading statement in religion. I think I've made a pretty good case for God being created in our own consciousness. But you know, there's still a possibility he's out there somewhere. He could be over the next hill. But you know, I asked you to look at the Earth's geologic record. This is a record going back 4.6 billion years. This graphic, it's just a little distorted, shows the geological record, all of the 4.6 billion years on the top, and the last billion years is blown up on the bottom. And you'll see that 40,000 years, which is the period of time that conscious humans have inhabited the earth, is only a very tiny fraction of this whole thing. Well, since 40,000 years ago, there have been evidences, of course, of intelligent life. At first, they were just little things like stones that were obviously chopped off in some way to make a tool. But then we have the explosion of intelligence to our current situation. But if we go back before the 40,000 years, where's God's artifacts in all of this? What mark did he make on any of this? And then there's the question, is God something or nothing? Supposed to be the most powerful force in the world, in the universe. Consider the case of the neutrino, which is a subatomic particle, quite a bit different than electrons, protons, and neutrons and other subatomic particles, in that it's very hard to detect a neutrino. But in 1953, through extraordinary experimentation, such a proof was made by two physicists. This demonstrates that the neutrino, which is so passive, so unobservable, that it can literally pass all the way through the volume of the Earth without interacting with the matter in between. That's how passive it is. Well, you could say that the neutrino is barely something, but it's definitely not nothing. Well, what about God? We're still looking. Next hill. God is more elusive than a neutrino. Is God something or nothing? This graphic shows this. The gray indicates all of matter and energy, and the small band to the right is neutrinos, which are sort of just barely there. Then there's God. God is on the right. I put a box around him because otherwise, how would you know he's there? Conflict, endless conflict. Recall that science embodies conflict resolution because intuitive explanations are tested to confirm or deny their value. Religion represents intuitive statements that have never been tested for their value. Grave problems result when such intuitive statements are canonized into religious doctrine. You cannot declare truth by fiat. The result is endless conflict. Suppose gravity was nabbed by early theologians, and cleric A said that gravity was caused by demon A. Oh, well, that's just an intuitive statement. Another cleric might say, no, he's caused by demon B. And they fight. And they ultimately set up their own theologies based on these ideas. We may never have gotten to gravity as a force because nobody could ever study it. And I love the lottery for its intuitiveness. Consider an average player. Player has a combination of numbers, and they say, this is the winning combination. Well, you say to them, well, is this other is this other set of numbers just as likely? Oh, no, this is the winning combination. Well, then the test, of course, shakes all this out, and there's only one winner. But suppose along the way, winners all declared themselves, that the players declared themselves winners by fiat and set up an armed camp to enforce the so-called truth. This is paramount conflict, but this is the state of religion today. Religion promulgates outdated morals. You know, our morality is still heavily based on those ancient scriptures. But what mankind advances through time, but Scripture does not. This sets up terrible barriers and unfair reckonings for classes of people like gays and lesbians, women seeking abortions, and minorities. And I say that women are particularly vulnerable. The Christian Bible condemns women to subservient positions. And the Quran teaches that women are no better than dirt. In both of my books, I make a plea for discussion, meaningful, rational discussion of religion. How true is it? We need to get down to those ideas. You know, policies like religious tolerance and multiculturalism gives religion a pass because they're once again protected from any discussion. We need to be able to discuss religion in the same way that we discuss city planning. My case rests. God is an artifact of consciousness. Consciousness is baffling to us, and this makes it an ideal incubation site for God. If you talk about God in terms of a manhunt, you're always looking for him. But you know, remember the famous Fugitive series on television? Wasn't the fugitive, after looking for him all over creation, wasn't he found practically where people started looking for him? And I insist that we, in this search for God, we forgot the attic of our minds. God turns up to be behind our noses instead of under it. Religion, I'm almost done. Science does address humanity's rhetorical questions, but doesn't answer them. Who am I? Well, humankind, along with all of life, is a product of evolution. Do we have a purpose? Each of us creates his or her own purpose for living. And is there a future? Yes, our children. this is a summary of religion and intuition. It once again shows how religion never got out of the starting block and insists that everything it says is true. I have a prediction to end this. If women in time ever become the true equals of men, really true equals of men, and if God lasts that long, we will get to a situation where God will be referred to as she 50% of the time and he 50% of the time. And I think men who really started religion all those eons back will get tired of God and give up on it. These are two headlines that I've dreamed up for when God departs from our presence. God of eternity ends long-term contract. Details in section G. And finally, God of eternity reveals short-term status. Only 40,000 years? What gives? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Very good job. We have time for just a couple of questions.
I would posit that when someone forms a hypothesis, it's usually from scientific observation, and he then tries to interpret it according to the scientific principles that he has learned. I do not understand why you would consider an hypothesis intuitive.
Well, a hypothesis really is just a candidate explanation. And just about any kind of thought comes from an intuitive process. It's sort of like, well, first of all, how does it seem? And then we go from there. That's when we start testing, and we refine the process.
I wondered if you are familiar with Jared Diamond's hypothesis that religion orients itself around creating loyalties within a group, and that's the way it promulgated itself. And what you think of that hypothesis in relation to yours, and also one that I think is also relevant is the hypothesis that religion exists not only to promulgate morality, but to explain it. So you mentioned some of the moral failings of religion, which is true, but we do know certain moral truths, but have a hard time explaining them sometimes, and religion is used as an explanation, for example, why you shouldn't steal or why you shouldn't kill. What do you think of those hypotheses?
Well, I think that humanity is the basic issue. We are social creatures. We want to be with other human beings. Religion has been the gathering point for social interaction all through the eons. But I contend that the principal reason to worship God is a false one. We should just get together to celebrate our humanity and leave everything else out. And I really think that morality is something that advances over time as we reconsider how we treat each other and how we treat each other fairly. It's a subject of debate, but I don't think it's a subject of fiat. Thou shalt, and thou shalt this, and thou shalt that. I think, first of all, we all know basically what keeps us alive. You don't murder people. There wouldn't be anybody left pretty soon. These social codes are developed amongst ourselves, and I think religionists taking a lot of credit for it when I don't think it deserves it.
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear an explanation that says that the idea of God is intuitive. I can understand mathematical conjectures being intuitive because we have some experience before we state them. But God is the most unintuitive thing I can even imagine. And so how can it is possible to say that God is an intuitive explanation of anything?
Well, but I disagree. I think God is intuitive, and it's like if you're trying to answer these befuddling questions about ourselves, our first attempt is to command some kind of human assistance, whether that human assistance exists or not. Look at fairies and all kinds of, all these supernatural figures that have helped us or not helped us out through history. They're really creations of our imagination, but that's still intuitive. That's sort of how we would like it, or how it seems to us. And I'm using intuition in its broad sense, that it's how things seem to us.
Let's give Richard another big hand. We need to take a break here.